This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, the world's leading international professional body, which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Claudia Day, and in this new series, I'm delighted to introduce you to expert coaches and thought leaders who share their passion for generating self-awareness through insight tools. Our aim is to inspire and explore with you some of the most impactful tools available to us coaches and leaders. Welcome back to part 2 of our conversation with Alan and Kate. Today we will continue to cover VoicePrint, a tool that supports us in understanding our communication and the different voices that we use in different situations. For coaches, when you were talking about the advice monster there, of course, we have to quiet this voice as much as possible. And if we are a coach who has a preference or really likes this voice, that must be a challenge. How can coaches use this for their own development as coaches?
Lovely question. And there are so many practical uses, I think, of VoicePrint. First of all, I think as coaches, it's really interesting to connect the coach training that we've had to the voices or voice combinations that are relevant, and also notice the ones that are not relevant or not required here. So lots of coaches wrestle, don't they, at the beginning of their journey with giving advice and wanting to give advice and wanting to solve the problem for their coachee. And lots of coaches will go on a journey of learning how to quieten that advised voice that we've just been talking about. And also, more than anything, quieten the voices that your internal self-talk. That first step of clearing your mind and clearing your emotions. So I go back to my 5 lenses of psychological, emotional, behavioural, physiological and systemic. So what's our mindset as we approach coaching? What's our emotional map as we're going into a coaching session? And what are the behaviours perhaps that we need to be displaying? And I think VoicePrint very much clicks for me here into this behavioural piece of what voices do we want to be using in our coaching session today and what's going to be really helpful. And obviously things like inquire and probe are obvious coaching voices to start with the big open-minded questions and help a coachee to explore a question, a topic from an open-minded perspective, and then probe to drill down perhaps. I think articulate that voice of setting things out I often think of it as at a relationship level as a playback voice. So that idea of playing back what somebody said using their words, that idea of clean language. Articulate for me represents that voice in a relationship dynamic. So I often would encourage a coach to think about the extent to which they're using their articulate voice to play back what they've heard or to set out what they've heard the coachee say so that the coachee can hear themselves, that moment of mirror up that we talk about. And then it's interesting, we could have a long conversation about this. I'm not sure we've got time today, but the extent to which those controlling voices have a place in our coaching dialogue. And certainly I have found comfort in being clear about the challenge voice as a coach. So to interrupt in order to improve, is that the definition of challenge? And often that's where we put the tension on the rubber band, as it were. We really start to stretch. We go from a kind of cosy fireside chat we don't want towards something that's much more productive, that's got energy, that's got dynamism, that's about movement. And so for me, that challenge voice has a part to play. And then I'm kind of, we could talk a long time about to what extent is evaluate appropriate, for example, because evaluate is about weighing up the pros and cons, but it's typically it can be coming from your own map of the world. And so that doesn't have its place, obviously, within the coaching dialogue. However, what we might be interested in is thinking about evaluate and thinking about how do we help our coachee to evaluate their options, to weigh up pros and cons, to consider the dynamics in something. So I think it's really helpful as a framework for a coach to be aware of the 9 voice modes. And beyond that, to have an understanding of these pressure voices, because when we're coaching individuals, so much of what we hear in our coaching rooms is the impact on an individual, on a coachee, of unproductive conversations that have been happening, where there's been misunderstandings or where emotions haven't perhaps been as helpful as they could have been in a particular exchange, perhaps with a manager or a peer. And therefore, just noticing that really as a coach, noticing that perhaps some of the dynamics in something could have some roots in what VoicePrint helps us understand.
Can I just build on that? To the question, how can this help coaches in their work? I think there's two very rich areas of coaching opportunity that can be opened up through a VoicePrint profile. One is this question about what happens to this individual when they come under pressure. And pressure is immensely difficult to generalize about, but that's great. Because what that means is you have to do what VoicePrint always tries to do anyway, which is put the individual and their lived experience at the center of the conversation, leaving the tool merely to be a means to enable that conversation to be rich and useful. The pressure aspect, I think the boundary between being able to draw on our voices, our repertoire of voices successfully, or finding that repertoire shrinking when we come under pressure, and us over-relying on particular parts of the repertoire and then overusing them with the result that they often land more poorly than they otherwise would. I think that area is massively important because so many people are under so much pressure so much of the time. And also because we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that not all pressure is debilitating. Some pressure is stimulating. Some pressure is energizing in a way that it gives us access to resourcefulness that we otherwise don't, in the general course of events, take enough advantage of. So that's one, I think, really rich area. The other is, because I agree with Kate's point completely, having a full set of skillful voices at your disposal will make you a more successful and effective coach. No doubt in my mind about that. And there are two particular patterns of voices where the combination of voices or the dynamic of one voice flowing into another can be very, very potent. One is a classic problem-solving pattern, and it combines the voices of advise, evaluate, and diagnose. And if you're looking at the triangular graphic, you'll notice that forms a little triangle of its own, one from each cluster. And the process of solving problems can start in any one of those places. I've witnessed it start in any one of those places. If it doesn't balance those three elements, it's going to be an impoverished form of problem solving. So having awareness of that as a coach, if as a coach you're called upon to help somebody either solve a problem or acquire the skill of solving problems for themselves, that's a very powerful pattern to have. The one that I think is even more powerful combines the three voices of articulate, challenge, and probe. And again, the process can start in any one of those places, and it can move in any direction around that little triangle. But if it doesn't include all three ingredients, what you lose is a high-quality, deep, generative conversation that goes where conversation may not previously have gone and yields things that it probably has not previously yielded. So if I were advising coaches to do a VoicePrint and use it to good effect in their work, I'd say choose those three areas because you'll find it really helps you to do some fabulous work for your coaches.
Can you bring it to life with an example?
Let me see if I can without revealing identities and things like that. So my background is manufacturing, and a lot of the work I've done as a consultant has been in manufacturing, not exclusively, but a lot of it. There's a pattern of thinking in the world of manufacturing, which is, right, what's the problem? And somebody will say, well, what the problem is. And they'll have that answer very quickly at their fingertips. So it's like, right, I have a diagnosis. The problem is X. Right, well, what do you recommend? So you go from diagnose into somebody says, well, in my experience, listen to the words, in my experience, drawing on what I know in the past, what I would suggest is, any other options? Evaluate voice. Right, okay, well, it sounds like we better do that. Now, it's bounded. It's already confined by the initial assumption about what the problem is, the particular past experience that's being drawn on to come up with a recommendation, and the consequently narrow boundaries of the options that are being set up there for evaluation. And if it's a fairly routine problem, that won't get you into a lot of trouble. If it's an unfamiliar problem or an emergent issue that we've never seen before, you're going to get caught out there because the initial diagnosis won't be sufficiently rich. It won't have been broad enough. It won't have spotted enough causality. It won't have understood the implications and the further repercussions of those implications well enough. Consequently, the advice is going to be too backward looking and not sufficiently in the present of the new situation that we're dealing with, and the evaluation won't be adequate. Switch into that other pattern I was describing of probe, challenge, articulate. So we'll give you a very specific example. Do you remember the unpronounceable Icelandic volcano that exploded some years ago? And all of a sudden, air travel all around the world was grounded because of the very proper fear that ash would get in the engines and all the airplanes would crash. So there we have, it's not entirely unfamiliar problem because there's been volcanic ash ingress into aircraft engines in the past, but on a scale where the instant response was, oh, ash in engines, need to ground everything. Well, do you? Or do we not understand the implications of this particular episode, where it's occurred, the amount of ash in the atmosphere, where the winds are blowing, blah, blah, blah. And it calls for a different pattern of engagement. And if you notice how that dialogue unfolded, it started off, the experts took an expert but essentially retrospective view, and it was then challenged by the airlines. That means for obvious commercial reasons, can't fly, can't make money, indeed lose money. But the other pattern then of, well, hang on a minute, probe. We need to dig deeper into the specifics of this particular case of volcanic eruption and its impact on the atmosphere. We need to arrive at a shared understanding, articulation, of the situation we actually find ourselves in. We need to challenge that because all the way through this thinking, we are going to inevitably be governed and potentially limited by our existing understandings. So challenge serves to keep sharpening our thinking process. Ah, yes, but have we thought of? Ah, yes, but what does that mean? So the dynamic in that generative problem-solving pattern of voices is quite different.
And inside there, interestingly, my brain goes to, what are the specific questions we need to answer here? What's the outcome that we're looking for here? So that depth of probe, helping us to not make assumptions. In the first example, there's a lot of assumptions. So one person is diagnosing, I've seen it, I've figured it out, I know what the problem is, it's this. And therefore, in my advice, the way forward is that.
Yes, because the very best probe questions, we often don't know what they are until the moment when we are formulating the probe as a result of something we've heard that doesn't quite make sense. So the real beauty of the probe voice is it's in the moment, is working with what is happening to try and get deeper to go further. And it helps the questioner sharpen the question. It helps the person being questioned to actually think about things they might not previously have thought about.
And this really reminds me of a conversation I was having last week with a group who were noticing that so often, back to this whole idea of task and relationship, we're so involved in solving the problem, the task, the thing at hand, that not enough time, intention, and conscious thought goes into what's the right construct of this conversation, what components or what dynamics do we need. It's a bit like the work of Nancy Klein with her time to think methods, is actually paying conscious time to thinking, what are the, for example, voice modes that might be really relevant in this particular dialogue? How do we need to set this conversation up for success? How do we hold ourselves within the right framing, have the right elements for the problem solving that we're trying to do, for the exploration, for the outcomes, as opposed to wander into conversations in a subconscious kind of way and all run our lovely sort of patterns as we do without really focusing on the construct, a bit like a dance. How do we go about doing this dance together? How do we hold our frame? What's the pace? What's the tone? What's the music? So I guess an encouragement for people to really think about that, give some time to deciding what ingredients you need inside your problem solving, as opposed to getting on with the problem.
That metaphor of the dance is wonderful because as you were talking and describing the example, I could picture you moving around. If we see the triangle as a floor, moving around the floor and using the different voices, tapping into them. This was a great demonstration of course, a way in which a coach can use this when talking to a coachee and helping navigate a situation with a coachee, just bearing in mind which voices is the coachee using. Then, Kate, you also mentioned as a coach, what are the voices that I can use in a coaching scenario. The one we haven't really touched is the listening side of it. So as a listener, I also have voices. We've spoken a lot about which ones should I use, but more the ones I'm listening with. And so I wonder if you can briefly cover how we use the listening voices.
So VoicePrint has in its suite a listening profile. I like the way you describe them as listening voices. I don't quite do that, but I see why it's useful to do it. What the listening profile does is it challenges a piece of advice that is very often given to us. So we need to listen actively, we're told, but it's not clear what that means. And we're also very often told you need to give the other person your undivided attention. Now, that's a very laudable suggestion, but it's extremely difficult to do in practice. And if you scratch that a little bit, you've got to ask yourself, why is it so difficult? And the answer is because our attention, if not wanders, it goes from place to place. And actually, that's its function. That's not a problem. That's what attention is for. It's to move around. So the question then becomes, well, where does it go? If while we're listening, it's not fully giving our attention to the other person all the time, where else might it be going? Now, what the VoicePrint listening profile does is, again, it's a tool that's designed to make us stop and think about this stuff. So it doesn't produce an ideal answer, but it produces a little map, which is analogous to the VoicePrint triangle, that says, broadly speaking, there are 3 ways or 3 areas in which one's attention might be going while one is listening. And you could produce a more refined version of this, but as a starter point, this is a nice way of doing it. You could be listening to find out, aka exploring. You could be listening to sort things out, aka positioning, or you could be listening to decide about, aka controlling. And as we've started using this, and this only started using at the beginning of last year, this new profile tool, we find that practically everybody, in fact, everybody who's ever been through it, divides their attention to some degree or another in all 3 places. And if you think about that, well, of course we do, because we don't neutrally receive stuff. If we're listening to find out, we're already taking it on board and starting to do something with it, with the best will in the world. That's the way our minds work. So the question is, are we aware of where it's going, and are we balancing this? Again, it's an issue of balance to good effect. Are we getting the right combination of finding out, sorting out, and deciding about, or have we got some habitual tendency as a result of not having thought about this enough and not being sufficiently sensitive in the moment and to the requirements, as Kate's described this beautifully, the requirements of that particular interaction, where our attention should be allocated? But what we're discovering, interestingly, a couple of snippets, is the human tendency to be deciding about as we listen is very pronounced. So we often shortchange, or we introduce filters, bias, preconceptions of all sorts into our finding out. That's a pretty important finding. A second one, which is a source of some dismay in my view, is that we do much less listening, or we do much less sorting out while we listen than we might usefully do. And what very often happens is, yes, we listen to find out, but then we go straight to deciding about. We haven't done enough sorting and organising and nuancing and finessing of what we're hearing before moving to action.
It's interesting, isn't it, to what extent this is a human condition, as you say, Alan, because we're designed to filter. We're designed to walk into a room and not have to work out that the thing in front of us is a chair. And so lots and lots of examples of the fact that we put things into buckets, we stereotype things, it's all filters, ways of which to operate more efficiently and effectively in the world. And therefore, to what extent is that impacting our ability to really listen? Because we're listening to decide, i.e., we've already figured it out, we've got one that looks a bit like this, or we've seen a bit like that before, and therefore it's one of those, as opposed to being intentional about, let me stay curious for longer, let me stay in the exploring zone. As you're talking, it makes me think about the different hats we wear. And actually my own listening profile, which was a bit different, I think, to the norm you took me through. So my listening profile appears to break evenly between all 3 corners. And Alan and I were sort of discussing this last year and what might be going on with that. And for me, I think it's about the hat I'm wearing. If I'm wearing my coaching hat, I know I want to go in to listen, to be curious. If I'm wearing my design hat, if I'm architecting a leadership development program, or I'm thinking about new material or concepts or content, I'm definitely listening to make sense of, to connect, to figure things out. And if I'm wearing my business owner's hat and I'm in an operational meeting, I'm listening to direct, I'm listening to decide, because I know somebody on the other side wants to know, can they spend some money, or can they take the decision, or what's my view on this thing? So I think for myself, I'm listening with slightly different hats on at different times.
And the beauty of that is you then have command of that resourcefulness, because you're being deliberate in how you deploy the capability, which is what VoicePrint, both for voices and for listening, is designed to enable us to do.
Really, really interesting. For me, the listening profile is now coming into my work more and more. And I see a real reason why we may start with the listening profile before we go towards VoicePrint, actually. Before we start to think about how we talk, let's think about how we listen first. That's going to be great fun for me this year.
In the audience, step to awareness of how they think and how to go about being more on the sorting side of it, Alan. What do you want to leave them with?
How do you do more sorting out?
Yeah.
Well, the first thing is catch yourself from going too fast into deciding. So slow that part of the process down. You know, the temptation. Oh, right. Okay. So that means, does it? Maybe. What else? What else might it mean? Hold yourself back, bring yourself back to that place. And I like Kate's phrase, stay curious. So yeah, what are the possibilities? How does this relate to what I already know? What's new here? What's different? What I haven't quite made sense of yet is a great question. Just what's a surprise? Let's tag that and come back to it. So I'm going to continue to listen, but I'm going to just make sure I'm feeding this process of sorting out, taking a bit more time over that than I ordinarily would.
I might pose a question here about, what do you notice when you're listening that happens to you physiologically? So when you're listening, to be curious, to explore, what's going on in your body? When you listen to decide, what's going on in your body? Where's your energy? For me personally, there's something different between my energy being almost up in my head and between my ears, versus as I get towards deciding, listening to decide, I feel it drop into my stomach. I feel a real difference in my physiology. And when I'm listening to make sense of, if you like, that positioning area, I notice that my eyes and my hands and my body go sideways on a horizontal axis. I'm looking left to right, I'm thinking, I'm comparing, I'm contrasting. So I haven't dropped down into my stomach yet. And I'm not up in my ears and up in my eyes. I'm somewhere in between. So I'm quite curious to understand, as we learn more and more about the listening side of this, to what extent there's a physiological cue we could be paying attention to in our energy, our emotions and our body that tells us, oh, hang on a minute, to Claudia's question, how do we stay in a particular listening mode more consciously? There may be some cues here from a body perspective as to where our body's gone.
I'm sure that's right. I would also be inclined to believe that the clues will be idiosyncratic. Your clues will not be the same as my clues and so on and so forth. But the broader point of being aware of them and being able to draw on the clues and turn them into devices to help us manage ourselves as well as recognize what's going on for ourselves is really powerful. And of course, something that we try to do with VoicePrint, because although the VoicePrint model doesn't directly, the questionnaire doesn't ask about nonverbal behaviors, but as I said much earlier in this conversation, this is a way into the whole issue about how we interact and how we communicate. And if it raises the issue, and we encourage it to raise the issue of prosody and nonverbal behavior and gestures and postures and so on, yeah, absolutely. That's all part and parcel of what makes the whole subject a very clue-rich environment if we just spend time working with the clues.
I find it trickier to visualize the listening side than the communicating side. So it's definitely an interesting journey. And you mentioned, Adam, that this side of it is starting. So I guess it will be nice to see the journey where it evolves.
Very happy to come back and tell you more about how it's evolving, because there's some very interesting things emerging.
And what a rich area that would be for you with your own coach, Claudia, just to take that as a curious question as to what might be going on for you. Why might it be that you can connect more easily with the voices and the voice modes?
Yeah.
When you're trying to connect and visualize the listening, that's more tricky. Okay, so what's that about? How would we work on that together?
A great way to take it to supervision, I guess, as well.
Absolutely.
We've got one VoicePrint practitioner I was discussing this with recently, and the question she uses a lot in her coaching, she says to the coachee, where are you listening from?
I love that one. Absolutely love it. Where are you listening from?
Fabulous question. Where are you listening from? And if they say, don't know what you mean, well, think about it.
Yes, a lot of information here, of course. And just to wrap this up, we have to cover, you've already touched on some of this, but let's just go through it. Of course, when we look at these tools, we look at validity and reliability. And so, of course, you've mentioned some of the theory behind it and the fact that it does come from theory. And I've recognized some of the things I saw on the test as well on myself. And there's a 360 where other people also, the behavior can be seen. But could you go a bit deeper into validity and reliability for the audience to try and grasp where you are at with that?
Yeah. Full disclosure, the discovery of triarchic theory actually came after the original design of the triangle, which was reassuring because it said there was an intellectual foundation for what had initially been an observation on my part, which is that 2x2 matrices, while they're a very good way of exploring the relationship between two variables, always leave something out of the picture. You know, they are a frame, but frames both focus and exclude. So VoicePrint started with, let's assume there are three considerations. Let's make this three-dimensional rather than two-dimensional. Now, to the issue then of validity, some of that came obviously out of the discovery that there's a whole and very extensive and a respectable body of work to say that an awful lot of models about the world are actually triangular in their shape and revolve around that threesome of pressures or variations on them. Specifically the validity of the VoicePrint questionnaire. Yeah, well, we started doing that when we had about 500 sets of results, at which point I did a big piece of cross-correlational analysis without getting into lots of frightful statistical speak, which probably makes very dull listening on the podcast. What that revealed is that there's very little overlap between each of them, which is kind of crucial. And indeed, the dysfunctional forms, the so-called pressure forms of each voice, are distinct from the, as it were, routine forms. When we got to 2,000 sets of results, I then submitted them to a professional statistician and psychometrician at the University of Oxford, who, when I engaged her to do it, she said, yes, okay, I'll do this analysis for you, Alan. You do know, don't you, that 80% of all diagnostic tools are absolute crap? And to which I said, uh-huh. I said, well, where do you think mine will turn out? She said, I don't know. The figures will tell us. Anyway, the good news is when she rang back with the results, she said, well, I've got good news for you. You're in the 20%. So a piece of what I describe as weapons grade analysis that was done there, bits of statistics that I don't practice myself as an amateur, but it confirmed the original finding from 500. There's clear evidence of distinction among the 9 voices and among the pressure forms of each of the 9 voices. Now, that's a massively important point because it means there is some sort of empirical reality behind these constructs. Factor analysis revealed that the 9 are very clearly separated, which is nice. The reliability issue, at one level, is a much trickier one. At another level, it's not tricky at all. It's tricky for psychometrics purists who are wedded to personality theory because personality theory is rooted in type and trait theory. So its premise is that questionnaires should examine characteristics that do not change over time or circumstance. Now, the effect of that, of course, is to cause a circularity. So you can only ask questions which, in their view, will yield the same answer if you ask them again in the future. Well, that's fine if you want to look at things that don't change. VoicePrint, however, isn't looking at things that don't change. It's looking at a set of ways of communicating, ways of talking, which we use all the time to greater or lesser extents, and which, in the light of some heightened awareness, we might then use differently. So the notion of test, retest reliability actually is nonsensical for a tool which is designed to look at our resourcefulness and human adaptability. And interestingly, my professional psychometrician, when I first put that argument to her, sat there looking a bit shell-shocked and said, "Oh, yes. Oh, you really are challenging the roots of personality theory." And I do, because VoicePrint is not a personality tool. It's looking at individuality, which is made up of many things. Personality types, traits are part of what contribute to the shape of an individual's profile. So is role, so is context, so is willingness to learn. There are many factors which may or may not bear on an individual, the shape of an individual profile. And it's that dynamic nature which so many tools don't possess that I think is a crucially important part of VoicePrint. I got a bit animated there. Sorry about that.
Well, it was good news that we can consider it valid. Then the other side of it, of course, is content validity. And does the tool cover all relevant aspects of communication?
We've sort of talked about that, haven't we, when I made the point about nonverbal behaviors? No, it doesn't. Not directly through the VoicePrint tool, but through the conversation that we encourage practitioners to have with individuals and teams and organizations about the nature of their own patterns of talking and listening. It's a way in. VoicePrint's a way in. So it's chosen to use these, what I call voices, which are really a metaphor for packages of behavior, purposeful types of behavior. It's a way into the issue of communicating and interacting, which lends itself very quickly to, right, and what does that look like? What do you notice? What do you feel? The question that Kate posed a few minutes ago. So it doesn't exclude those things. It absolutely recognizes that they're relevant to the whole issue. And it does what I designed it to do. It raises awareness about these issues and provides a basis for talking about them and acquiring the sort of understanding that really matters, which is understanding that you can use in practice.
And of course, in the 360 profile, we get so much more what I would call the qualitative data coming through. So in the self-perception, it's much more numerical, it's quantitative, it's the frequency of the voices, it's relative to the norm group. Is this, in theory, a voice that is present in your kit bag, or is it underused or overused, perhaps in relation to the norm group? Whereas in the 360, we get all of the qualitative commentary from line managers, from peers, from people that know the individual and see not only the talk, experience the talk, but experience the body language, experience the energy management of the individual, their accent, their pace, their tone. To what extent are they really good at signalling, saying what they mean before they choose to use a voice? This is where I'm coming from before I probe you, so you feel psychologically safe to go there with me. So you get a lot of rich data coming in through the 360, which gives so much more richness to the topic of communication and certainly allows the individual to compare and contrast what they know of themselves to blind spots. And actually, from my point of view, is one of the best sources of feedback for an individual, no matter what point they're in their career.
Yes, what I would say is that the most important thing is to treat the evidence coming out of the questionnaires, be that the self-perception or the 360, as sets of clues that need to be connected to the individual's lived experience. So what I always do and always advocate that practitioners should do is get very quickly to the specifics of the role they're in, the challenges that they're facing. So one of my favorite questions is, so tell me about your frustrations. What frustrates you at work? And that gets you very quickly to a point at which resourcefulness is struggling. And you can open up from there into all sorts of specifics about their world, because that's what matters. What are they trying to do? Where are they trying to do it? That's much more important than the tool per se. Tool's merely a way of then shining some light on those issues and some ways forward.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way of closing to remind us that the individual is the most important part of it and that the tool is just there to support the process, but it's focused on the individual. Is there anything else that you would like to share with the audience before we finish?
A couple of reflections from me, I guess. So one would be, I'm sure you've all heard this before, but people love to say that certain people they know seem to love to talk for the sake of it or to hear their own voice. And yet in all of the conversations and coaching sessions I've had with people, I've not come across a person. And so I often ask people, what's your role in this conversation? So if somebody continues to advocate a position, it tells me perhaps that they don't feel heard. And if they don't feel heard, what's your responsibility to show them that you have heard them? Perhaps you are not articulating back what you've heard that person say so that they feel heard in order that they stop advocating. So for me, there's something going on in here around how do we each take responsibility for our part in dialogues that we are in? Yes, we're different. There are introverts, there are extroverts, different ways we like to use our talk, but we all have a responsibility to be active in a conversation if we can. So that would be an encouragement of mine. And another one in delivering lots and lots of profiles would be, to what extent are we using our evaluate voice to good effect? Many organisations value challenge. We recognise that, to what extent are we challenging things around here? It's good if you can challenge. It seems to be connected to this idea of providing strength, problem solving. And yet I feel that challenge a lot of the time is the end of your thinking. The challenge that you make is the end of your evaluation. You'll have sat there thinking about something, weighing something up in your mind, deciding that something's not meeting your preferred way of doing it, and therefore go into challenge. And yet before that, you would be considering the pros and cons perhaps, or making a light evaluation of things. And many people I work with discover that perhaps they're not using their evaluate voice to such a good extent as their challenge voice, and look to balance that one or bring that one through more, to be more considered, to make more space for other people, to understand where they've been coming from, to notice why somebody might then end up at the challenge that they're making because of the evaluation they've been doing. And in sharing your evaluation, you're actually opening up the conversation to be much more participative to the other party by saying, well, what do you think of my evaluation? Do you agree with my 3 options and the pros and cons, and therefore why this, the challenge, is the right way to go? And so, again, an encouragement from me for the audience to consider over the next few days, how often are you evaluating as opposed to challenging?
Thank you for sharing from your experience and leaving us all thinking about that. Well, how can the audience get in contact with you and Alan as well to learn more about your journey, which has been going for a long time, but is still continuing?
Many, many years. Yeah, the best way is either through the VoicePrint.global website or through the TalkWise website, talkwise.com.
In UK, where can the audience contact you to hear more about your vast experience applying this?
Well, you can find me at Make Waves Group. So that's makewavesgroup.com. It's the organisation that I founded with my business partner, Sarah Glover. And a lot of our work, in fact, a lot of blogs and thoughts and things are up on that site, talking about our experience of working with clients in this field. And outside of there, you can find me on the usual channels like LinkedIn.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing with us everything about your tool, Alan, and everything about your experience applying it, Kate. It's been lovely to chat with you. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make sustainable differences to individuals, organizations, and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our website at associationforcoaching.com. Explore our digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, member benefit interviews, podcasts, and a portfolio of live events featuring thought leadership tools, models, and the latest industry trends to help you develop your coaching experience.